Monsters, murder, mayhem. The world of gothic horror and pulp fiction comes to life every week on Wednesday's Weird Stories. Welcome back to Wednesday's Weird Stories. This is your weekly home for all things gothic fiction and pulp stories, all those old spooky things that you may have completely forgotten about, but they're still out there lurking for you somewhere. If you're just tuning in for the first time, every week we choose a different public domain horror story from authors like H.P. Lovecraft, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, even Robert Chambers, people like that have really made a name for themselves in that old-time spooky story world. Throughout the 18th and early 19th century, there were really a ton of these authors, and actually, let me correct myself, there's more the late 1800s, early 1900s, to properly term that were really big on looking at what it was that happened with all these, what happens after you die, and looking at monsters, and really looking at how they can tell stories to scare people, and looking at those crazy things that may have been formerly just old folk tales, and really trying to bring them to life in a more modern time and a more detailed fashion than what maybe some of the old folk tales were. This was also kind of a time when, like, the spiritualism movement was really taking off, where there were a lot of people, just, your common folk, trying to, get in touch with the dead and discovering mediumship and things like that, and taking it beyond the idea of, maybe just shamans could reach for this, but that, everyday people could have seances and speak with the dead. And a lot of these authors really took this idea and ran with it to, what is the downside of that? What is the potential negative outcome that could happen of all of this communication with the dead and all of this? And are there bigger things at work here as well? And when it comes to looking at what monsters may lay out there, and what some of the negative consequences of dealing with some of these supernatural forces, H.P. Lovecraft was a force in this, and really a prolific short story writer, putting together these tales that within just really a few pages, creating stories that left you really wondering about the world around you, and could some of this be real? Crafting stories about the whole Cthulhu mythos, and this... If you read through his stories, I mean, there's a reality that's drawn into them that you can really look at it and be like, yeah, that could have actually happened. I know somebody that acts kind of like that. Maybe this isn't quite as much fiction as one might believe. So when it comes down to his stories especially, and that's what we're going to be focusing on, one of his stories tonight, it's looking at, I like to think that there's a little bit of a morality tale in each of his stories as well, and really in most any story. I just personally find it hard to believe that these stories are created without some sort of morality and parable kind of feeling to them, that you can really pull out a little lesson to be like, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. If you were listening last week with Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, definitely a strong story about the dangers of alcoholism and overconsumption of such. And tonight's story, The Terrible Old Man, is really one of those, obviously it's a tale about not breaking in and robbing people, but it's also a tale about not judging a book by its cover, and not assuming that the feeble old man down the street is just that, a feeble old man. So, all right, this with tonight's tale, The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. It's a shorter one, so this we're not going to be spending a whole lot of time. So this is a pretty quick one to get through. And with that, let's go ahead and jump into The Terrible Old Man by H.P. Lovecraft. It was the design of Angelo Ricci and Joe Channock and Manuel Silva to call on the terrible old man. This old man dwells all alone in a very ancient house on Water Street near the sea, and is reputed to be both exceedingly rich and exceedingly feeble, which forms a situation very attractive to men of the profession of Messrs. Ricci, Channock, and Silva, for that profession was nothing less dignified than robbery. The inhabitants of Kingsport say and think many things about the terrible old man, which generally keep him safe from the attention of gentlemen like Mr. Ricci and his colleagues, despite the almost certain fact that he hides a fortune of indefinite magnitude somewhere about his musty and venerable abode. He is, in truth, a very strange person, believed to have been a captain of East India clipper ships in his day, so old that no one can remember when he was young, and so taciturn that few know his real name. Among the gnarled trees in the front yard of his aged and neglected place, he maintains a strange collection of large stones, oddly grouped and painted, so that they resemble the idols in some obscure Eastern temple. This collection frightens away most of the small boys who love to taunt the terrible old man about his long white hair and beard, or to break the small paned windows of his dwellings with wicked missiles. But there are other things which frighten the older and more curious folk, who sometimes steal up to the house to peer in through the dusty panes. These folk say that on a table in a bare room on the ground floor are many peculiar bottles, each in a small piece of lead suspended pendulum-wise from a string. And they say that the terrible old man talks to these bottles, addressing them by such names as Jack, Scarface, Long Tom, Spanish Joe, Peters, and Mate Ellis, and that whenever he speaks to a bottle, the little lead pendulum makes certain definite vibrations as if in answer. Those who have watched the tall, lean, terrible old man in these peculiar conversations do not watch him again. But Angelo Ricci and Joe Channock and Manuel Silva were not of Kingsport blood. They were of that new and heterogeneous alien stock which lies outside the charmed circle of New England life and traditions, and they saw in the terrible old man merely a tottering, almost helpless graybeard, who could not walk without the aid of his knotted cane, and whose thin, weak hands shook pitifully. They were really quite sorry in their way for the lonely, unpopular old fellow whom everybody shunned, and at whom all dogs barked singularly. But business is business, and to a robber whose soul is in his profession, there is a lure and a challenge about a very old and very feeble man, who has no account at the bank, and who pays for his few necessities at the village store with Spanish gold and silver minted 2 centuries ago. Messrs. Ricci, Channock, and Silva selected the night of April 11th for their call. Mr. Ricci and Mr. Silva were to interview the poor old gentleman, whilst Mr. Channock waited for them in their presumable metallic burden with a covered motor car in Ship Street, by the gate in the near tall rear wall of their host's grounds. Desire to avoid needless explanations in case of unexpected police intrusions prompted these plans for a quiet and unostentatious departure. As prearranged, the 3 adventurers started out separately in order to prevent any evil-minded suspicions afterward. Messrs. Ricci and Silva met in Water Street by the old man's front gate, and although they did not like the way the moon shone down upon the painted stones through the budding branches of the gnarled trees, they had more important things to think about than mere idle superstition. They feared it might be unpleasant work making the terrible old man loquacious concerning his hoarded gold and silver, for aged sea captains are notably stubborn and perverse. Still, he was very old and very feeble, and there were 2 visitors. Messrs. Ricci and Silva were experienced in the art of making unwilling persons voluble, and the screams of a weak and exceptionally venerable old man can easily be muffled. So they moved up to the one lighted window and heard the terrible old man talking childishly to his bottles with pendulums. Then they donned masks and politely knocked at the weather-stained oaken door. Waiting seemed very long to Mr. Channick as he fidgeted restlessly in a covered motor car by the terrible old man's back gate in Ship Street. He was more than ordinarily tender-hearted, and he did not like the hideous screams he had heard in the ancient house just after the hour appointed for the deed. Had he not told his colleagues to be as gentle as possible with the pathetic old sea captain? Very nervously, he watched that narrow oaken gate at the high and ivy-clad stone wall. Frequently he consulted his watch and wondered at the delay. Had the old man died before revealing where his treasure was hidden, and had a thorough search become necessary? Mr. Channick did not like to wait so long in the dark in such a place. Then he sensed a soft tread or tapping on the walk inside the gate, and heard a gentle fumbling at the rusty latch, and saw the narrow, heavy door swing inward. And in the pallid glow of the single dim street lamp he strained his eyes to see what his colleagues had brought out of that sinister house which loomed so close behind. But when he looked, he did not see what he had expected, for his colleagues were not there at all, but only the terrible old man, leaning quietly on his knotted cane and smiling hideously. Mr. Channick had never before noticed the color of that man's eyes. Now he saw that they were yellow. Little things make considerable excitement in little towns, which is the reason that Kingsport people talked all that spring and summer about the 3 unidentifiable bodies, horribly slashed as with many cutlasses, and horribly mangled as by the tread of many cruel boot heels, which the tide washed in. And some people even spoke of things as trivial as the deserted motor car found in Ship Street, or certain especially inhuman cries, probably of a stray animal or migratory bird, heard in the night by wakeful citizens. But in this idle village gossip the terrible old man took no interest at all. He was by nature reserved, and when one is aged and feeble, one's reserve is doubly strong. Besides, so ancient a sea captain must have witnessed scores of things much more stirring in the far-off days of his unremembered youth. So there you go. So not necessarily really pointed as far as what happened to the guys, but the terrible old man, he had his way with keeping his stuff protected, and when you're working with ghosts of your former crew, I don't think it's a good idea to go trying to rob the guy. So poor Mr. Ricci, Channick, and Silva definitely met their doom at the hands of a bunch of ghosts with cutlasses and all of that good stuff. So there's your lesson. Just because you think that your mark is a weak, feeble old man, there may be a whole lot more behind that than what you can see or even imagine. So don't go robbing people, all right? Don't do it. There's ghosts that are going to cut you up and throw you in the sea. So that is our Wednesday's Weird Story. Like I said, it was a short one this week. We're going to be coming back next week with The Street of the Four Winds by Robert W. Chandler. And this is an opportunity for you to check out all of these cool little stories. I invite you to invite your friends. We're doing live streams on the Rock Soul Radio Facebook page at facebook.com/rocksoulradio. And you can find the archive for all of these stories at podcast.rocksoulradio.com. I invite you to check them out and like the ones that you really enjoyed. Follow the stream there so you can stay up to date on when each of these gets posted and all of that good stuff. So thank you very much for tuning in. And with that, I will bid you adieu until next week. Thank you for tuning in to Wednesday's Weird Stories. Join me each week for a new tale from your favorite Gothic authors, and catch up on missed episodes in the archive at podcast.rocksoulradio.com.